Is the dress blue or is the dress white? My name is Josh Coker, and today we're talking about sense and perception as it pertains to psychology. And anybody who's been on the internet in the last few days has probably seen a picture of this dress. And the crazy thing is the fact that it has polarized the social media community. Some people see white and some people see blue, but the question is, how is it that hundreds of thousands of people are looking at the same picture and seeing something different? And that's what brings us to the topic at hand, which is sense and perception. So what I'd like to do is first talk about what are the similarities, what are the interrelationships between sense and perception, and then also how are they different. Next, I'd like to talk about some real-world examples and some scientific studies that have gone on recently explaining this phenomenon. And then lastly, what I'd like to do is give you an idea of how you can take this information and use it in your everyday life to your advantage. So, now that you have an idea about what we're going to talk about, let's get into the first point, which is how are sense and perception interrelated? And how are they different? Well, simply put, your sense obviously encompasses all of your five senses: sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and a sense that most people don't know that they have, which is called kinesthetic sense. And that is the sense of your body's motion. It knows where it is while it moves. And what happens is, our body takes all of these senses and uses them to obtain information from the outside world. And this information is then received through receptors throughout all of our different senses and translated through it's taken through the nervous system and put into the brain, where then all that data is translated and filtered according to what it's prioritized. And that's where we get into the second part of the topic, which is perception. Now, perception is kind of tricky because it's person dependent. The way that we take all of the information that our brain has received and filter it out and also prioritize it to then turn it into something that is tangible, that we can make decisions based off of, that is very person dependent. And to give you an example of what I mean, we'll use a car. Because see, what happens is your mind uses what's called the reticular activation system in your brain. And what it does is it will focus on things that you have determined are important to it. And then it will go out and find more information that will either basically bring it pleasure or avoid pain. So, for example, if you wanted to buy a new car, and let's say the car that you want to buy is a Lincoln Navigator. Well, every time you hear the word Lincoln Navigator, every time you see an ad in the newspaper about Lincoln Navigators, every time you see a commercial on TV, or every time that you're driving past one of those vehicles, your mind is then going to take that and consume it and identify it as something important, and therefore will be brought to your attention. It has prioritized it. Whereas some people they could go through all day and not even notice that they passed by 10 vehicles of that type. The reason is because everybody's psyche is a little different. Now, if you still don't believe me, go ahead and take a look at this picture right here. What do you see? Is it a duck or is it a bunny? Now, some of you may have instantly thought duck simply because I said the word and the audio cue instilled in your psyche that it should be looking for a duck. Some of you may have saw a bunny, but the point is they're both there in that picture. But the point is you saw the same data, but it was interpreted differently. Essentially, that is perception. So, let's talk about some real-world examples and then maybe some scientific studies that kind of give us a better idea of how this phenomenon is happening and how it affects us very, very deeply. First, imagine that you're out on a camping trip and you wake up in the middle of the night because you have to go to the restroom. And while you're out there and you're walking to the porta potty or whatever, you hear a twig snap. Now, some people may not even hear it because they're so tired they don't even care. Others may hear it and instantly imagine that it is a deer because they know that they're in the woods, and that makes a lot of sense. A deer is in the woods, or maybe it's a rabbit or a squirrel or something to that effect. Now, other people who are more paranoid, who maybe have certain aversions to being in the woods, might perceive that as a bobcat or even as a stranger in their camp. And the whole thing is that because their psyche, through all of their experiences in life and the way it's developed over time and maturing, has been built that way, that's what it prioritized as to interpret the information as either a threat or a non-threat. And it's the same information, but two people could view it very differently. And to further bring home that point, I did some research and I found a very interesting article on how social power can determine your perception. And essentially what happened was some researchers got together and they had people look at a box and different objects and say, what is the weight of this object? And interestingly enough, people with higher social power saw the items as weighing less, and people with lower social power saw the items as weighing more. And a really good example of this in real life that you may have experienced before is if any of you are adults and you've gone back to your own old high school for a reunion, or maybe your kids go there now, and you look at the teachers or you look at the school and it looks significantly smaller, you may say, well, how did this happen? Why did I used to think that it was so big before? And the reason is because your relationship to the school, to the structure itself, and to the teachers themselves has fundamentally changed because your social power has increased since then. And so therefore you don't see the things as heavy as they once were. Another example of how certain things in our environment can affect our perception can be illustrated by this article that was published in Neuroscience just recently in 2015. And essentially what the researchers did was they took subjects and they put them in a pitch black room and they sat them down in a chair and they said, visualize yourself going to the right or visualize yourself going to the left. For you guys it's opposite because my right, your left. And what happened was then they would turn the chair the opposite direction, and then they would ask the person, what direction did you move? And interestingly enough, they thought that they moved in the direction that they perceived, that they visualized in their mind that they were going. And so what they deduced was that there is an ocular vestibular connection in your mind. The vestibular system is essentially the system that is your balance for your direction. And what they determined was what they determined was that the images that you see will affect your perception of the direction that you're going in everyday life. Now, I know a lot of you guys are out there saying, okay, so what? That's a lot of interesting information, but how does it help me in the real world? Well, that brings me to point number 3. And to illustrate this point, I'd like to go to the 8-time world champion at memorization who wrote a book called Learning to Remember. And in his book, one of his major memory techniques that he talks about is using scent to remember. And what he says is, because the scent sensory is directly tied to your mind memorization, your memories, the functions in your mind that help remember, it's one of the best tools to use when you have to remember great deals of information, new information, all kinds of stuff. So a perfect example of this would be if you ever walk into a room and you smell home-baked cookies or homemade pizza or maybe fresh coffee brewing, and it automatically brings you back to this nostalgic moment from your childhood when maybe your mother or your grandmother had freshly baked cookies or freshly made pizza, or maybe your dad made coffee every morning. And you can vividly visualize everything that was going on at that time. Well, the reason is because scent acts as a very good neural cue to retrieve those memories. And so, if you ever wanted to use this to your advantage in the real world, what you could do is, say, as you're studying for an exam, every day that you study, for however long you study, you chew the same kind of gum. Maybe it's Big Red, maybe it's spearmint, but you keep the same flavor. And then, the day that you go in to take the test, you chew the same piece of gum. And then what that's going to do, it's going to help act as a neural trigger to retrieve those memories that you built while that scent was present. Now the same thing can hold true for a presentation. The problem is you can't really chew gum during a presentation. So another great idea would be to take a piece of chapstick, say cherry or peppermint or whatever is your favorite flavor, and put it on your lips each time that you're practicing your presentation. And then on the big day where you have to go into your boss in the company and give the presentation, use that same chapstick. And what that's going to do is it will act again as a neural trigger to help you remember those key concepts that you use to develop the speech in the first place. So, there it is on a very high level. That is sense and perception, and we discussed how they are interrelated but also how they're different. I give you a few real-world examples to show you how they can affect you in your real life. And then lastly, we talked about some ways that you can take that information and use it to your advantage in real-life situations like an exam or a presentation. So, I hope this has been helpful and you find some value in this information. Until next time, take it easy.